For decades, the popular Catholic mind has regarded predestination with disdain, ordinarily viewing it as a Calvinistic heresy.
Different. As Catholics, we don't believe in predestination.
But what if I was to tell you that predestination is a Catholic dogma? Others, understanding this, will attempt to put forward a Catholic understanding of predestination, bastardizing the historic teaching of the Jesuit order, the teaching of St. Robert Bellarmine, Francisco Suarez, and Luis de Molina, by claiming that predestination to grace is after the consideration of our merits.
The Thomistic view affirms a total predestination of the elect through no condition, like the Calvinists.
Yet in most, if not all occasions, their articulation of Molinism violates Catholic dogmas, as we will see throughout this video. Lastly, very many will understand well all the above, yet will deny the idea of a, quote, double predestination, accepting that God predestines individuals to heaven, but denying any relation of the predestinating will of God to hell.
It would be a monstrous thing for God to do, and the church rejects that. It's called double predestination.
Yet this too is against Catholic dogma, as we will see above. In most theological questions, there are what are called opposed errors. These opposed errors, in order to retain some truth, corrupt another truth. In the issue of predestination, there were some who wished to retain the truth of the freedom of the will, and by that attempt destroy the doctrine of predestination. These are called Pelagians. Others, in order to retain the truth of predestination, destroy the truth of the freedom of the will. These are called Predestinarians. Further, there were some who wished to so elevate the universality of the will of God to save that they destroyed the particular will to predestined. These are called Semi-Pelagians. On the other hand, there were some who wished to so elevate the particular and efficacious will to save that they destroyed the universality of the will of God to save. These are given the ecclesiastical designation of Calvinist. Yet it is important to remember, as we can also see with the description of Semi-Pelagian, that these historic descriptions conform to the beliefs of a historic group of individuals to a more or less degree. With some designations, the description is spot on. With other designations, it is describing the popular understanding of the error. With others, it is describing the followers of a certain individual rather than the individual himself. And lastly, with others, there is almost a complete disconnect between the described heresy and the individuals who supposedly hold these errors. Anyways, the Catholic Church, rather than emphasizing one truth over another, holds all these seemingly opposed truths in tension, following the teaching of divine revelation rather than the feelings of tension that they may have. It is the job of the theologian to come in and begin to explain more and more the coherence of these seemingly opposed theses, and show how they do not contradict, even while we will never be able to see the intimate reconciliation of these theses until we see God as he is. Some of these theologians have tended to emphasize one part of the mystery over another, tending closer to one or another heresy, over-exaggerating one point of the mystery at the exclusion of another. Still, other theologians have taken the position of the radical centrist, corrupting the truths not by any overemphasis, but by seeking solutions that are in the middle of the seeming contradiction, underemphasizing all the relevant truths. Lastly, there is the theologian who faithfully holds what Revelation teaches, holding the tension where the mystery becomes too obscure and shining the light of reason on where reason can go. In the most difficult questions, there are two radically opposed and erroneous solutions, one sinning by excess and the other by defect. Afterwards, there then appear mediocre, eclectic opinions, opportunistically attenuating and juxtaposing the extremes in a kind of mechanical, non-organic way. However, truth is found in the peak, where there is an organic and positive reconciliation of the various aspects of the truth that are obscured in the opposed errors. End quote. Yet it is important to remember that, while we can critique the methodology and solutions of this or that theologian, we need to remain faithful to the toleration that the Church has of the number of different solutions to this problem. So this video will be an investigation of the limits of Catholic theology to this problem, and, Lord willing, I will make a future video that goes over the various systems classically set forth by theologians. But before we continue, Have you ever wanted to read a book that is meant to be an entire introduction to theology, written by Thomists and meant to bridge the gap between catechesis and higher scholastic studies? Well, I have the perfect book for you. The Theology Library is a 6-volume introduction to theology written by nearly 70 French Dominicans in the 1950s, some of whom were students trained by the great Reginald Marie Garrigou-Lagrange, in order to be a comprehensive introduction to Thomistic theology for those laymen interested in Catholic action. Get your set today through the link below. In order to set the boundaries of Catholic theology on this problem, I will give a series of different theses, explaining them and then showing where the magisterium teaches these. First, God desires the salvation of all men. Second, God only predestines some to salvation, who will infallibly be saved. Third, God predestines all salvific acts. Fourth, predestination to the first grace and to its entirety are both before the consideration of merits. Fifth, there is a positive, consequent reprobation on the part of God. Sixth, there is no positive antecedent reprobation on the part of God. The first thesis is simple. God desires the salvation of all. I don't really need to go into that one. Before we continue on to the next thesis, we must ask the question, what is predestination? Pope Adrian I cites St. Fulgentius to define the term, writing, "As for that, however, which some of these say, that predestination to life or to death is in the power of God and not in ours, they say, why do we try to live? Because it is in the power of God. Again, others say, why do we ask God, that we may not be overcome by temptation, since it is in our power, as in the freedom of the will? For truly, they are able to render or to accept no plan, being ignorant of the words of blessed Fulgentius against a certain Pelagius. Quote, Therefore God, in the eternity of his changelessness, has prepared works of mercy and justice. But for men who are to be justified, he has prepared merits. He has prepared rewards for those who are to be glorified. But for the wicked, he has not prepared evil wills or evil works, but he has prepared for them just and eternal punishments. This is the eternal predestination of the future works of God, which, as we have always acknowledged to be taught by apostolic doctrine, so also faithfully we proclaim." End quote. Here we see that predestination is something broader than the idea of election. Election concerns the choosing of such and such a person by God. But, on the other hand, predestination concerns the ordering by God of certain means in order to bring about a certain end. It is the order of salvation, what providence is in the natural order. This is why St. Augustine describes predestination in terms of the, quote, preparation of gifts. Since predestination, in Catholic theology, is God's preparation of the various different graces he will shower upon us in order to bring us elect to beatitude. In our second thesis, we see that this predestination to glory is not of all men. In the papally approved Council of Valence III, in the year 855, it states, quote, But also it is seemed right concerning predestination, and truly it is right, according to the apostolic authority which says, Or has not the potter power over the clay, from the same lump to make one vessel unto honor, but another unto dishonor? Where also he immediately adds, What if God, willing to show his wrath, and to make his power, endured with much patience vessels of wrath fitted and prepared for destruction, so that he might show the riches of his grace on the vessels of mercy, which he has prepared unto glory. Faithfully we confess the predestination of the elect to life, and the predestination of the impious to death. In the election, moreover, of those who are to be saved, the mercy of God precedes the merited good. In the condemnation, however, of those who are to be lost, the evil which they have deserved precedes the just judgment of God. In predestination, however, we believe that God has determined only those things which he himself, either in his gratuitous mercy or in his just judgment, would do according to Scripture, which says, Who has done the things which are to be done. In regard to evil men, however, we believe that God foreknew their malice, because it is from them, but that he did not predestine it, because it is not from him. End quote. Keep in mind that this quotation also touches on the fifth and sixth thesis. Thus, while God gives sufficient grace to all men, flowing forth from his will that all be saved, the infallible ordering of graces to the end of glory is only given to some. From this consideration, the third thesis flows. That is, not only are all those who are saved predestined to glory, but also each and every salvific act. The papally approved Council of Orange II, in the year 529, states, quoting St. Prosper, "The good will of God and of man. Men do their own will, not God's, when they do what displeases God, but when they do what they wish, in order to serve the divine will. Even though willingly they do what they do, nevertheless, it is the will of him by whom what they will is both prepared and ordered." End quote. These last three theses are the most controversial of the theses that we will discuss. As to the fourth thesis, many claiming the name of Molinist sin against the faith by denying this thesis. Yet, it is important to note that neither Molina nor his most faithful followers ever denied that predestination to the first grace is before the consideration of merits. For they, as all Catholic theologians, affirm that grace is the principle of merit. Thus, the controversy between the Molinists and Thomists is not a controversy over whether predestination to grace is before or after the consideration of merits, but rather whether predestination to glory is before the consideration of merits. This is why, in the quotation above from the Council of Valence, it states that, quote, "In the election, moreover, of those who are to be saved, the mercy of God precedes the merited good." End quote. Further, we can look at the same text in order to establish the fifth and sixth theses. Yet, we need to explain the technical language attached to each of these theses before we begin. But before we continue, remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Further, if you like content like this, please consider supporting the channel at patreon.com/MilitanThomist or giving a direct donation at christianbwagner.com/donate. In the fifth thesis, I use the language of a, quote, positive consequent reprobation. All this means is that this is a predestination to the punishment of hell that happens after the commission of, and on the basis of, the evil that the individual has committed and is personally responsible for. This is why, in the quote from Valence above, it states the following, quote, "In the condemnation, however, of those who are to be lost, the evil which they have deserved precedes the just judgment of God." End quote. This leads us to our sixth thesis, that there is no positive antecedent reprobation on the part of God. The sense of this thesis is that God does not, before one has committed sin that makes them liable to hell, positively order them to hell. This is what is commonly called predestination to hell, or predestination to evil. In Protestant circles, this error is often called equal ultimacy. There is clarification on this point in Valence when it states the following, quote, "In regard to evil men, however, we believe that God foreknew their malice, because it is from them, but that he did not predestine it, because it is not from him. We believe that God, who sees all things, foreknew and predestined that their evil deserved the punishment which followed, because he is just, in whom, as St. Augustine says, there is concerning all things everywhere so fixed a decree as a certain predestination." End quote. Further, the Council of Trent clarifies the scope of this thesis, stating, quote, "If anyone shall say that it is not in the power of man to make his ways evil, but that God produces the evil as well as the good works, not only by permission, but also properly and of himself, so that the betrayal of Judas is no less his own proper work than the vocation of Paul, let him be anathema." End quote. Thus, the Church leaves open a type of antecedent reprobation, professed by all non-Molinist theologians, even those theologians following Suarez and Bellarmine. This is called an antecedent negative reprobation. God chooses to permit some individual to fall into sin by withholding infallibly efficacious grace to that individual. Then, by the act of positive consequent reprobation described above, God chooses to impose punishment on account of the sin that they fell into. This is what St. Thomas meant when he stated, quote, "As predestination includes the will to confer grace and glory, so also reprobation includes the will to permit a person to fall into sin and to impose the punishment of damnation on account of that sin." End quote.